Hello again. I told you I was going to do a video on our lecture material, and I want to just highlight a couple of things, reinforce a few things that we went over in class, and perhaps pull out a couple of extra things that I think would be significant for you to think about. So let me attempt here to share my screen. Let's see. Sometimes it lets me share the screen, and sometimes it doesn't. So, okay, here we go. I think you can see this one here. And let's see if I can take us to a slideshow. There we go, we're on the slideshow. We're talking about the Gospels. And as I mentioned before, the Gospels in the Bible are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but that's not the order in which they were written. Mark is almost universally considered to be the gospel that was written first. That's not necessarily that the stories that are in it are older than anything else, but it's most likely the first one that was written down. And part of what makes us believe that is because when you look at the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, they both contain almost the entirety of the Gospel of Mark. And so it makes sense for us to think about the writers of Matthew and Luke having a copy of Mark's gospel as they've written it. There are a couple of ideas that Mark was actually taken from those that someone took Matthew or Luke and sort of took away material, but that seems to be less credible to us. So we don't tend to think about that as much. But Mark is the shortest by far. It talks about Jesus in different ways, as I mentioned in class, including the Son of God and Son of Man. So he has divine and human aspects to him that are being highlighted. And it often talks about him as a servant of God who is suffering for one reason or another. Usually that gets defined in theology and in history as suffering for the sins of humankind. That's not necessarily the only interpretation, but that's one of them that's there. And then we have the idea that he's the Messiah, but he's often telling people, don't tell people what's happening there. It has a relatively rough style. So whoever wrote down Mark didn't spend a lot of time editing. So we might think about today where someone has a first draft that they're doing rather than the final copy that gets published. It is the just the facts kind of Bible. It doesn't have a lot of extra commentary that's in it. It doesn't talk about, well, the Old Testament said this had to happen. And it doesn't talk about, well, these are the theological things that you need to understand. It just tells you what happened. And there are a couple of different things in it that make us believe that this was an eyewitness, but not one of the big 12, not one of the key disciples. So it was also another follower of Jesus. But we know that there were others other than just the 12. We know in at least one in story that we have 70 or 72 people that Jesus sends out. So this was often quite a large group. We have a sermon in the book of Acts, and we'll talk about that next week, that Peter did that follows the same outline of Mark. We have the sort of the announcement, the herald, Jesus is baptized, he does some miracles, he's on his way to Jerusalem, he gets crucified and resurrected there. This is the same outline of Peter's sermon, and this is the same outline of the Gospel of Mark. So they probably share a timeliness to them along the way. Peter's sermon, just like Mark, doesn't talk about when Jesus was born, doesn't talk a lot about the theology of things. He just says what happened along the way. John Mark was probably someone who went around with Paul. We have references to that. I mentioned the name John as being a common thing back then. So we have lots of Johns in the ancient world. So John Mark, we sort of shortened to Mark. That he could write and write down well enough to be entrusted with this tells us he had some education. Most likely he was also someone who had some money because he could pick up and move around with the Apostle Paul. But at some point he gave that up. And we have some references in Paul's letters that there might have been some tension there, if it is in fact the same person. But along the way, he was a helper in churches, he was a helper for Paul, And as he was writing this, most of what he talks about seems to be geared towards people who are not native Hebrew or Aramaic speakers. Remember, as I've talked about before, Aramaic would have been the main language that was among the speakers that Jesus was talking to. So in several points, and I didn't highlight this, I think, enough in our class in Mark, there will be words like Boanerges or Talitha Kum, or sort of other Bartimaeus, that is, son of Timaeus. Anyone who spoke Hebrew or Aramaic would know what those words meant. It wouldn't have to be says means sons of thunder, means little girl, I say to you, get up. They would just know. So he's translating for the audience along the way. He also has to explain Jewish customs. If you're already Jewish, you don't need to know about hand washing ceremonies and other kinds of things like that along the way. So this is probably the earliest of the Gospels. There are lots of people who think it was written either in the mid 50s to the early 60s. Most likely it was after Peter arrived in Rome, maybe after both Peter and Paul arrived in Rome. But before either of them were put to death, most likely, because we have no references to anything about that, even sort of cryptic notes along the way. It is intended to be historical. It is intended, and it's just the facts kind of thing. It's just a sort of laying out, again, that sort of police force kind of witnessing, and it's meant to teach you. So this is not intended in the first place to be a complete biography. This is intended to be an outline. And in fact, one of the purposes of Mark is the idea that Jesus is coming, and Jesus is coming today. In fact, Jesus might come before you get done with this reading, so you better read it fast, mister. That kind of thing. So he didn't waste a lot of time. He wanted you to read it and get on with it. So you could read it in one sitting. You could read it out loud in one standing. Someone would stand up to a crowd and read it, and that would be done at different times along the way. So it had quite a bit of action. So there are lots of things that are in there. Jesus does this, Jesus does that. He teaches and he works miracles and he heals and he goes to Jerusalem and he's crucified and all of that sort of stuff. But the first 45 or the first 60 to 65% of the book is the 2.5 years. The last third, at least, is all 1 week. And sometimes it happens hour by hour by hour. So you can tell what the important stuff is. All of that earlier stuff just leads up to this, and this is the important thing. And the important thing is from Palm Sunday, when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, to the crucifixion on Good Friday and the resurrection on Easter. There are no post-Easter appearances of Jesus in Mark along the way. There are 16 chapters. One of the things you might notice in Mark, though, most of your Bibles will show this. It will show a shorter ending and a longer ending of Mark. And scholars are still debating, is the longer ending a later addition, or is the shorter ending someone chopping off the longer bit? And the reason why your Bibles, almost all of them, will always have both and indicate both shorter ending and longer ending is because we don't know. And the oldest manuscripts we have one of each. So that's something to keep in mind. There's no discussion of Jewish law. Gentiles wouldn't be interested. Jewish customs are explained. Jewish people wouldn't need that, but the Romans would along the way. On the other hand, by the time we get to Matthew, this is written primarily for a Jewish audience. So the law is there. And as I mentioned in the other video, when you're sort of thinking about the Christmas story, one of the things that will happen is they'll tell you the story, and then they'll tell you a little bit. This was to fulfill what was spoken in the prophet Isaiah. This was what was spoken in the Psalms or other things. It's talking about the fulfillment of prophecy. And in Matthew, he wants us to think of Jesus as a new Moses. Come back here. It's going away from me. There we go. He wants you to think of Jesus as a new Moses. Moses, of course, was the lawgiver and the deliverer. He delivered the people out of bondage along the way. But we have a new take on what it means to be a Messiah. we have a constant reference to the Old Testament here. So Matthew is assuming that the people who are reading it know about the Old Testament. Mark does not do that, because the people in the Roman church probably didn't know much about the Hebrew scriptures. So we have Jesus coming to fulfill the Old Testament's demands. He has to be a son of Abraham. He has to be a son of David. And the intention, he has to be the Messiah. He has to come to fulfill certain things that the prophets have said. And these include being a king and a law giver and a teacher and the Messiah, all of these things together. So we often will see Jesus referred to as rabbi. We think of rabbis today as the clergy for synagogues, for the Jewish people, but the older term rabbi simply means teacher. And so that shouldn't throw you if you see that in there along the way. We have a couple of different outside sources that reference the book of Matthew, a guy named Papias and a guy named Irenaeus. Notice their dates here. Papias is 125 and Irenaeus is 185. So these are quite old in terms of our usage, but they're also quite late with regards to the time of Jesus. This is almost 200 years after the time of Jesus. So we know Matthew was an earlier book, but we don't have any specific reference to it from others reading it until about the year 100 or later. So in trying to date how old it is, it becomes an issue. It uses Mark, and it also has a higher quality Greek that we're talking about there. So where was it written? Chances are good it was written in Israel, in Galilee. It was written for people in Jerusalem and in and around Judea and northern Israel. There's another school of thought that it might have been written down in Antioch, which was a city just north of there that was one of the big crossroads of the ancient world. But in truth, it's probably written down in and around Jerusalem and Galilee, which is where most of the activity also takes place. One of the things that happens, of course, is that Matthew and Luke both take on Mark, so they're probably contemporaries. But one of the things that happens, of course, is we also think about Peter, who is referenced in Matthew. He's also referenced in Luke as still being sort of treated as a living figure. So he hasn't been martyred yet. So we're going to guess that it's sort of around the year 62. We typically think about Matthew as being written in the early 60s along the way. And why was it written? Well, it shows Jesus doing miracles, just as Mark does, but it also shows him as someone who the Old Testament said, this is what's going to happen. And that is something that's different from Mark. It also has a genealogy. And the genealogy here, if you think of Ancestry.com, goes back to David and goes back to Abraham. So it shows he is a son of Abraham. Old Testament said that had to be true. Says he's a son of David. Old Testament said that had to be true. But one of the things that happens, of course, is that this isn't just for the Jewish people. So the kingdom can't just be for the Israelites, and we have the Great Commission, go and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is, in fact, one of the things that makes Matthew, especially for Gentile Christians in the early world, one of the key documents, one of the more important documents. It looks for the future. That's what this eschatological term means. There are some end-time prophecies and later prophecies in there. Everything is done from a Jewish perspective, though, because Jesus was someone of the Jewish people, and he was coming to fulfill the Hebrew prophecies. It is ecclesiological. That's a fancy word that basically means it's church-based. It is actually looking towards forming a community, later to form into what we call the church. And it is particular. One of the things that it's looking to set up a particular community along the way. And these are the particular emphases which we've talked about before. So all of these things are things that help us understand the Gospel of Matthew. Luke, on the other hand, wrote 2 books. I highlighted in our class the 2 different openings where it says in this book, because so many things have been written down, I'm going to try to make it clear what's true and what's not. And we know there were a lot of other gospels and a lot of other stories floating around. So Luke said, well, we've got to cut through the fake news here. We've got to cut through all of the memes on Facebook that don't actually correspond to the truth. And this is what's true. And then, of course, at the book of Acts, he will say, well, in my first book, I did that. And in my next book, I'm doing this. And they're both addressed to a guy named Theophilus. It's a very elegant style. It's a very attractive style. It's got a particular way about the language. Whether or not people are Christian, they hear the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son, and it speaks to them. Whether or not they're Christian, whether or not they're even religious, they can hear about the Good Samaritan and say, yes, I can resonate with that story, and that's an ethical way of being. So this is something that can appeal outside of a narrow group. It is intended to be a history book, but again, like all the other Gospels, it's not intended to be a complete biography. It is the longest writing of the New Testament. When we put Luke and Acts together, it is the longest particular writing. He's careful as a historian because he was not an eyewitness. Both Matthew and Mark, as well as John, as we'll see in a moment here, have elements in their story that indicate they were there. There is none of that in Luke, because Luke was someone who was also probably in that city Antioch, which is outside of Israel. This came along later, and he was writing in Greek for a Greek audience, and he probably wasn't a priest or a minister or a scribe or anything. He was probably doing this outside of his sort of regular profession. So quite frequently, notice the stained glass windows that I have up behind me here. Each of the figures here are highlighted. They often have symbols around them. Whenever we look at Luke, he usually has a symbol of some kind of medical or physician kind of implement, so that we know which one it is. As a result, he, of course, was very well educated. When we're looking at this, we know that Acts was probably written before the time of Peter and Paul's martyrdom, because neither of those are referenced. So it has to be before the year 70. And in sort of, I would say odds are it was going to be in the early 60s, because we don't have a reference to the martyrdom of James or the destruction of Jerusalem either, which came along in the 60s, and then Jerusalem itself in the year 70. That most certainly would have been highlighted in the text. Why? Because Jesus predicts that. And if Jesus had predicted it and it came true, there's no way that would not have been referenced. So the fact that it wasn't referenced meant it didn't happen yet, and thus we can date this to at the latest the mid-60s, probably the earlier 60s. I talked about Theophilus as being not just a proper name, but also any of us who might be someone who loves God. Theo, like in theology, theocratic, that means God. The Phileus, if you think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Theophilus means someone who's in love with God, and that can be anyone who's being addressed. But there could have been one particular person who had that name, and that word, so we can't discount that. It talks about God's kingdom. It talks about God's universal offer, which means this is for everyone, not, again, just for the Hebrew people, not just for the people in Jerusalem. Of course, Luke is a Gentile, and Luke is living in Antioch away from that, so of course that would be important. But he also emphasizes the Holy Spirit's role, which is something we don't see any really of in Mark, and very little in Matthew. So this is what was meant to come after Jesus was taken up, and we'll see that in Acts, and he promised to send the Holy Spirit to continue with the community along the way. Luke has a structure that begins with the birth, just as Matthew does. Talks about a little bit of what's going on. Why is he writing this? It has a genealogy. It has some miracles. Then it talks about the travel as Jesus travels towards Jerusalem. He also tells the parables. There are a lot of parables that are only in Luke. The parable, again, the two that I've mentioned, the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, are only in Luke. And then the trials and the crucifixion that happens. So this, like others, is historical, but it's historical with a purpose. And the purpose is to teach you about Jesus. It's not subversive. So you think, well, how is the Bible subversive? Well, in some readings, especially in Matthew and Mark, and again in John, we see either they're not so happy with the temple priesthood, or they're not so happy with the Romans. In Luke, we don't tend to have that as much along the way. So it's focusing really on Jesus and what Jesus did along the way. And it's also focusing on the people around him. So we have what's called the people orientation here. And it tries to involve the entire community, especially as we get into Acts along the way. So there are all sorts of different ways that we can look at the Gospel of Luke. These are some of the different ways when we're looking for Gentiles to come in, when we're looking to say, well, Paul was doing the right thing, when we're trying to combat Gnosticism. That's an interesting one. There was a group of people known as the Gnostics back then. And the Gnostics tended to think of Jesus as a spirit only, that he had a divine side but not a human side. So of course Luke, going through with all of this very human story, would be against that along the way. And that's an important thing. We don't tend to think about it as much today, but the Gnostics lasted for hundreds of years. And then we have the Gospel of John. John is often referenced as the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is a self-reference. This is not a reference someone else says, and this is not a reference that Jesus himself says. This is someone taking it upon himself as he's writing to write this. And sometimes I often wonder, it's sort of like if my sister and I were feuding, I might write, well, you know, I'm mom's favorite child, you know, I'm dad's favorite son, or something like that along the way. I don't think it was really written in quite that way, but I have to wonder if the other disciples had been around when this gospel was written, if they might say, what do you mean by that there along the way? So as I mentioned before, the word synoptic, basically, let me see if I can do in any typing here. Will it let me actually type into the text? Can I get the word synoptic? Well, I can, but it's not going to be very easy for us to see. There, hey. And can I actually make this larger? No, it doesn't want to let me make it larger. But there's the word synoptic. And synoptic, if you think about synonym, the same. Optic as your optical eye. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all look essentially with the same eye. John does something different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the Last Supper, but John does not. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have parables. John does not. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have the raising of Lazarus, but John does. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the baptism of Jesus, but John does not. So there are some key differences, not just some little differences, but some key differences that are there. So I also love this picture that we have here along the way. So when we're sort of looking at what's happening, we can see that John has a special mission, a special word. And one of the things that he does is he does word and deed. So often when we think about ministry in the church today, we often call it the ministry of word and deed, or the word and sacrament. And of course, the word is I am. I mentioned this in class. I am is the word or the phrase that was given to us from the burning bush when Moses asked, "What's your name?" to God, speaking out of the burning bush. So at different points in John, you can see all of these. I am the bread of life. I am the light. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Every time he says I am, he's saying God is as well. We also have some very important miracles along the way where he is healing others. He is feeding others. He is showing dominance over creation and showing dominance over death. Lazarus being raised from the dead is a foreshadowing in John of Jesus' own raising from the dead. So we have all of these different things that are key to the way John looks at things. Then, of course, the structure. John wanted this to be a new Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you go to a Hebrew synagogue, a Jewish synagogue, temple, you will see a Torah scroll, and the Torah scroll is something that they'll often parade around. This is a rendering of those 5 books. That's the Torah, that's the law. And of course, it begins with the phrase, in the beginning. Well, that's what happens in John as well. In the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis says. In the beginning was the Word, John says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Before all things, well, before that Genesis stuff, John is saying, was the Word. And of course, when we look at the book of Genesis, how does God create? He says, let there be light. And there was light. Let this. It's all spoken. It's through the Word. So John is actually taking this and holding these 2 books together and saying, this is another fulfillment. This is another part. And it's such an elegant thing. And it also references John the Baptist. John the Baptist is the first person we actually encounter in a human form, because the Word becomes flesh. Jesus comes a little bit later. We have miracles, we have miracle stories, and then we have the Passion. And notice here we've got 7 chapters of this. The Passion, again, is from Palm Sunday until the crucifixion. In all of this, we have a lot of theological development. A lot of those lines in my synoptic book that I've talked about before, a lot of the passages of John have blank, blank, blank when you're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because Jesus expounds for the disciples, in part because he knows this is his last opportunity in this earthly form to teach. So he's getting it in there. We do see that John was an apostle. In fact, he considers himself to be a favored apostle. He doesn't elevate himself above Peter. It's interesting that happens, even though he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. He doesn't elevate himself above Peter. He still recognizes Peter as the first apostle, and Peter, James, and himself, John, as sort of the big 3 among them. They're often the ones who are taken off as sort of a private group for prayer or other things. And when they come to the tomb at the end, again, it's John and Peter who are both sort of racing each other to get there. So we again think of him as one of the fishermen. Not all of them were, but many of the earlier ones were along the way. And most scholars tend to think of this book as being around the year 100. So it would have been far later than the others. If we think about Mark as being maybe in the late 50s or early 60s, we think about Matthew and Luke being 5 to 10 years after that. This one comes along 35 to 45 years after that. So this is quite a long ways away. Even at its earliest dating, 65, we're still putting it several years after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And at its latest dating, it would be quite significant. But we tend to put this here because this would have been around the time that if the Apostle John had been a very young man when he was following Jesus, if he'd been, say, in his 20s when Jesus was crucified, this would have been around the time that he was sort of an ancient man. We tend to think of him as dying around the year, or at the age of 100. And so this would have put that there for that. Again, this is a universal accord. This is meant to reach everyone who's out there, includes Jews and Gentiles. That we see, like in, again, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whosoever should believe. It's not exclusive to the Jewish people. It's not exclusive of the Jewish people. It is there for both. It is there for everyone. And that will then extend later into slave or free, male or female. The ideas in John correspond very well in some ways with what Paul will put in his letters. These stories are written to people who were not eyewitnesses and not around people who are eyewitnesses. By this point, all the eyewitnesses are gone. All of the disciples have dispersed and have died. Tradition has that they were all martyred. Paul is also gone. So all of the people who were around, this is sort of the last gasp. And a lot of the people who were the original believers have also passed away, and their descendants are now the second generation. That's what the audience, the primary audience, is there. So I've talked about these different elements in the Gospels, and these show up as well in John. Remember Logos here. The word in the beginning was the Word. That Greek word for word is Logos. That's there along the way. So that's worth studying a bit more as well. So I would recommend that. I will stop the sharing there. So you can take a look at the different themes in each of these. Again, you'll see some different details in the Gospels that are a little bit different. For example, there is a story about a lame man who is brought to Jesus, and there's too much of a crowd around, so they can't get through. So they climb up on the roof of the house, and they're literally digging through the roof to lower the guy down in front of Jesus. The story tells us this. Well, in an earlier gospel story, they're literally digging through. You think about the kind of adobe kind of structure of houses in Jerusalem and in Galilee and other kinds of places like that. So they would literally be digging through the dirt to go down into it. And it's not a surprise to go up on the roof. Lots of Middle Eastern houses to this day have a patio on the roof. It's a flat roof. There's not a lot of rainfall. There's no snowfall. So you don't need sloped roofs. You don't have to worry like we do here in Indiana that you're going to get so much snowfall on the roof that it's going to sink in. So therefore you slope it. That's not a consideration in the Middle East. You have a flat roof. You usually have a ladder or a staircase that goes up to the roof. And that's where you would beat the heat of the day. You'll have often sort of tent-like things on the top to keep the sun from beating down, but you're not inside the house roasting or baking. So you could literally dig through, and they lower Jesus down. Here's the thing to watch for, though. When Luke retells this story, Luke, of course, has heard this story, and now he's retelling it. They're taking tiles off the roof to lower the guy down. Well, where did the tiles come from? They weren't in the older story, and in Jerusalem or in Galilee or wherever this story would have originally taken place, they probably wouldn't have had tiles. But in Antioch, a wealthier city that's further to the north, most of the houses, certainly the better off neighborhoods, had tiles on the roof. So when Luke told this story, he was remembering what he knew about his neighborhood. When Matthew was retelling this story, he was remembering what he knew about his neighborhood. So it's not the details. It's not that kind of picayune detail. Well, were there two different stories with one? It's like, no. What they're doing is they're putting their own witness into it. And I think one of the experiences I had at my church in Bloomington, I used to be many, many, many decades ago, unfortunately, I'm old, notice, I was a member of Trinity Church, which is on Kirkwood. And every year they have a nativity set collection display. There are several hundred nativity sets in the collection there. So they'll usually put out about 50 or 60 in their gathering hall, and they'll leave it up for the month of December, essentially. Well, anytime after Thanksgiving until about Christmas. And they have nativity sets from the past and nativity sets from present day, and they have nativity sets from all over the world. And when I look at the nativity set from Kenya, all of the figures in there are dark shaded. When I look at the nativity set from Japan, the people have Asian features on their faces, and the manger scene is a paper house. The paper house like you might have in older style Tokyo. They would have never had a paper house like that in Bethlehem, not at all. but the people who were putting together that nativity set were relating the story to themselves culturally. See, that's part of what we talked about in our discussion board posts last week, is they take the culture and put the story in the culture. We do that as well. Where's a Christmas tree anywhere in the Bible? There's no Christmas tree. Where's an Easter bunny in the Bible? There's no Easter bunny. Where's Santa Claus? There's no Santa Claus. All of these things that become part of our expression of the holiday, they aren't sacrilegious, they aren't blasphemous, although there are a couple of churches here and there that say, no, we can't do that because it's not in the Bible. And that's a perfectly acceptable response as well. But in fact, we all do this kind of cultural adaptation. We all do this kind of cultural shifting around. What we need to worry about when we're doing this is we don't want to have what's called cultural appropriation. We don't want to take someone else's culture and put it into our culture and then say our culture is better than theirs. That's not a good thing to do. But to share in other cultures, especially if we do it respectfully, is a very good thing. And that's what Christians have been doing all around the world for 2,000 years. And it all started with the story of Jesus contained in the Gospels. So I thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.